All right, last time when we went through chapter 23, we looked at populations, and those were individuals of one species that lived in an area and interacted in that area and could interbreed. Today we're going to look at ecology at a little larger level, where we're going to look at all the species that live in one area and their interactions with the other species and with their physical environment. So this is communities, and when we talk about species in the physical environment, it's ecosystems. And so we're going to talk about some interactions and how communities change and how energy and nutrients move in the environment. Okay, and so there's a clownfish with its partner, which is another species, and that's a sea anemone. And so there's lots of interactions organisms have. Okay, in a community, we study those interactions, all the species that occur in one location, and then they interact. And often we talk about them as kind of like the forest community or the grassland community of all the species that live there. The trees, the insects, the birds, the mammals, everything. And so we talk about how diverse it is and how rich it is, and whether it can persist over time or whether it's going to change. Each species that lives in a community or a habitat has its own niche. And it's a term that kind of refers to the role that a species plays in a community. And so it's how the species uses resources like space, food, maybe nesting sites or areas that it escapes from predators. And so niches are like in these bird species here, they include kind of what food an animal eats, where it lives in the habitat, like a certain spot in the tree, what partners it has, how does it avoid predators. And a niche contains all these things, and so it's a very complex things. And a niche is defined not just by the physical environment, but by the interactions organisms have, by how they interact with other members that they might be competing for space or food with, how they interact with their predators, how they avoid the predators, how the predator allows them to persist, may still eat them, but allow them to persist. And sometimes species have partners, organisms that they're always found with or that benefit them, and these are mutualists. And sometimes these interactions are very direct, and you can see them like two animals fighting in competition. Sometimes they're less direct and hard to see, harder to predict. In the case of trees are competing really hard, but it's not they're not snarling and fighting, but they're trying to get to the light, and so they try and shade their neighbors, outgrow their neighbors. They're competing for things like water. And sometimes interactions are even more indirect, and we'll talk about that in the forum. But it's interesting. Competition is thought to be one of the most important interactions because there's limited resources in an environment, limited nutrients, limited amount of sunlight, limited amount of food. Predations are things that we talk about often when we see because they're exciting, but their mutualisms are important too. I often humans are really champion mutualists. We've domesticated a whole bunch of animal partners and plant partners, and those have allowed us to be really, really successful. And it's really also helped our partners, those mutualist partners that we have. Cows and horses are they're big mammals that are found worldwide. We've eliminated their competitors and made the environment safe for them. And so they have special features that we've kind of selected for, so they've evolved to have adaptations where they're good with humans. Likewise, plants like wheat and corn, we've spread those all around the world. And so we're champion mutualists. We use these animals and plants to benefit us, but we benefit them as well. Okay, Communities also, I shouldn't give you the idea that everything's hunky-dory. Communities change over time. There is what's called succession. Um, Communities invade new areas. They have pioneer species like weeds and grasses that are able to grow in areas where there's no intact soil. They can establish themselves on rock, on floodplains, and these are gradually replaced by other species that are, as the environment changes, because there are some plants there, there'll be shrubs and trees that may live, and ultimately the community may return to a forest after it's been disturbed. Mature communities are stable. They have dominant species that are able to kind of persist in the environment. They're like trees that are able to tolerate shade and produce a nice soil. Okay. And so communities have both a number of species in them, and they have all these interactions and they change. But communities also affect their environment, their physical environment. And we should talk about physical environment because that's one of the things that we're most concerned about. How communities trap energy and become productive, how that happens in food chains, and then how nutrients move through the community, because that turns out that that's really important, and we'll talk about it a little this week, but even more next week. So in ecosystems, we're concerned with how much energy enters the community through photosynthesis. This is done by the producers, the autotrophs. They capture energy from sunlight and produce compounds that other organisms can use. And so this productivity produces biomass. And then consumers eat that biomass, but they'll always lose some of the energy. And so no matter what, there has to be a producer. And then you've got the higher levels like herbivores and carnivores that are able to trap that food. And so we arrange these things in food chains to show that sunlight is captured by primary producers. Herbivores eat the sunlight, the energy from sunlight that's stored in those primary producers. And then carnivores are going to eat those herbivores and capture some of that energy. And so energy is going to, no matter if we're talking about the carnivore like an owl here, the energy it's consuming is really coming from sunlight. But that energy from sunlight has first been captured by the producer, then moved into the herbivore, and then the carnivore. But the energy first comes from the producers. We often show these things as an energy pyramid, where the producers capture the greatest amount of energy, and then the herbivores will lose some of that energy when they eat the grasses, but they'll be able to capture some of that energy, and the energy moves up the food chain. But each time there's less and less energy available for the large organisms that are the top consumers, like a hawk here. This kind of explains why big predators are relatively rare, because they require lots of producers and lots of herbivores to support them. And so this is referred to as an energy pyramid, and it kind of explains one of the relationships we see. Another really important relationship that we kind of keep track of in ecosystems is the movement of nutrients, of chemicals through the ecosystem, through organisms and the physical environment. And we call these biogeochemical cycles or nutrient cycles. And just like energy flows through an ecosystem, nutrients move as well. These nutrients could be things like water, or an element like nitrogen or carbon or phosphorus or iron. But these things move with the physical environment, and organisms have to capture some of them. So this little illustration shows the movement of water in a rainforest ecosystem. Okay, the water comes through rainfall, and the plants have to capture a large amount of that water And they use that during photosynthesis. That's called transpiration. So half of the water that enters that ecosystem is used by plants during photosynthesis. And another large amount of that water is lost through evaporation back into the atmosphere. And then some is lost as runoff. In biogeochemical cycles, living organisms can serve as a reservoir, storing nutrients, and you have non-living reservoirs like the soil. And then the atmosphere or things can serve as a flux. But in nutrient cycles, it's important to recognize life plays an important role. That life can take some nutrients and move them, maybe take them out of the air. That's called fixation, and it happens with both carbon and nitrogen. It moves water in transpiration, and it can make carbon available by capturing in photosynthesis or by decomposing it, turning it back to the atmosphere. And so life plays this really important role. Some of these nutrient cycles are well known to us, and we talk about them a lot, even in the general press. The carbon cycle is one that gets a lot of importance now because we're changing the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is CO2 is carbon dioxide, and that's always in our atmosphere. And plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis and make that available to herbivores and animals of the food chain. Some of that carbon is buried in organic matter or winds up in the water. And carbon can be released back into the atmosphere, but more often carbon is stored by the ecosystem. Of course, we've interrupted this by burning fossil fuels, and so we've put lots of carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. Another example of a well-known nutrient cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a limiting nutrient for many plants. They need nitrogen to make proteins and DNA. And really the source of nitrogen, the available nitrogen for plants, is in the atmosphere. And only some organisms can fix nitrogen. These are bacteria. And so some soil organisms can do this, and some plants, like soybeans and alfalfa, have these soil microbes right in their roots. They have these root nodules where they store them. But otherwise, we have to provide fertilizer to plants because nitrogen is such an important nutrient. So this is a really important nutrient cycle. And of course, another important nutrient cycle, again, is the water cycle. Evaporation and transpiration, water into the atmosphere, and then that water moves out by precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, and then runoff takes that water back to the sea, and you have groundwater. So these nutrient cycles are important to people because we depend on them for agriculture. We use the nutrients, and we want to make sure that our plants have enough nutrients to grow and that we have enough water for those plants. And so these nutrient cycles are really important to us, and they're important to understand them in natural communities as well, because natural communities are pretty effective at saving the nutrients, keeping them in the environment, saving nitrogen, saving phosphorus, making sure it doesn't wind up in runoff. And we know that species compete for them, and the large, long-lived species are the best competitors. They're the best at this, and this means trees. And so when we deforest areas, we usually lose a lot of nutrients. And agricultural plants are also they're kind of not like trees in that they need a lot of help getting those nutrients. And so for us, this is a big concern. Ecosystem ecologists do lots of experiments, and they've shown this by comparing deforested areas to intact forest. And so they would do experimentally, they deforest areas around a stream, and then they measure the amount of runoff and the nutrients in the runoff. And so they can see that, okay, if we take the forest out, we get more runoff, the soil becomes drier, and it loses nutrients like nitrogen and calcium. And so that's a big concern, and we're talking not just for forestry, but we're talking for agriculture. So these are important things. Okay.